It is easy to believe that nations act on ideology, that enemies remain enemies, and that political speeches reflect political reality. But history is rarely that clean. For decades, the United States publicly condemned Venezuela's leadership, its rhetoric, and its defiance of American influence. At the same time, the two countries were bound together by something far more powerful than words: oil. Not just any oil, but the kind the modern world could not easily replace. Behind closed doors, long after speeches ended and cameras shut off, an unlikely relationship endured, one built on necessity rather than trust, on silence rather than agreement. This is the story of an alliance that was never meant to exist, an arrangement shaped by geography, economics, and quiet compromises, and one that could not survive the weight of its own contradictions. Because while oil can delay conflict, it cannot erase it. What follows is not the story of a single deal or a single betrayal. It is the story of how two governments, openly hostile in public, became quietly dependent in private, and how one decision, small at the time, changed everything. This is a documentary about power, about energy, and about the moment when necessity stopped being enough. Before things changed. This is a handshake that never happened. According to every official record, these two men were never in this room. Their governments called each other enemies, regimes, threats to civilization itself. Yet for over a decade, this single agreement determined the price of fuel on street corners from Miami to Seattle. How does an alliance survive when it's built on pure hostility? And what happens when the silence finally breaks? Long before ideology, there was geology. In 1914, near Lake Maracaibo, the ground gave up its secret. What followed wasn't just oil, it was a new national identity. By the 1950s, Venezuela was among the richest nations on earth per capita. Caracas gleamed with modernist towers, a monument to petroleum's promise. But this wealth flowed through narrow channels. Its centralized power in Caracas, it created staggering inequality between a thin elite and a growing, frustrated underclass. Politics became a single question: who controls the oil money? For the United States, the calculation was simple, practical. Here was a stable, abundant source of crude, just a short tanker route from Gulf Coast refineries. American companies operated freely. This was extraction, not diplomacy. A partnership of pure convenience before the world became complicated. The foundation was poured. A nation's fate was now inseparable from the resource beneath its feet. But in the hills overlooking those glittering towers, resentment was building, and a new kind of leader was watching. As America's thirst grew, it faced a metabolic problem. Its own light, sweet crude was insufficient, and its vast refinery networks, billions of dollars of specialized steel along the Gulf Coast, were engineered for a specific diet. They needed heavy, sour crude to function at peak efficiency. Venezuela had exactly what these machines needed. Its oil wasn't just abundant, it was uniquely compatible, a perfect match of supplier and infrastructure. This created a quiet, critical dependency. Venezuelan heavy crude kept fuel prices stable. It protected profit margins. It was a strategic buffer, rarely mentioned in newspapers or presidential debates. The relationship was locked in place by engineering and economics. American refineries needed Venezuelan crude. Venezuela needed those refineries as its guaranteed buyer. It was a marriage of absolute necessity. But in Caracas, a man was rising to power who saw this American dependency not as a partnership, but as a profound weakness to be exploited.
The pressure moved from quiet to public. The United States escalated. First, financial sanctions, targeting individuals. Then, the decisive move, oil sanctions, an attempt to cripple the regime's economic heart. Venezuela responded by trying to pivot. It sent more oil to China, to India. But the economics were punishing, the distances greater, the discounts steep. Oil was now an explicit weapon in a public fight. But the result was not compromise, it was hardening. Pressure solidified positions. It accelerated the internal decay. The hidden pact was now openly hostile, a contradiction laid bare. And yet, even then, practical exceptions were made. Limited waivers were granted for specific companies to continue trading. The whisper of necessity still murmured beneath the shout of politics. The pressure was now public and intense, but the fatal blow, when it came, would not be delivered from Washington. The final collapse was not an attack. It was a failure of oxygen. PDVSA reached a point of systemic asphyxiation. The loss of skilled labor was catastrophic. When a pipeline burst or a compressor failed, there was no one left who knew how to fix it. Infrastructure failed. Refineries shut down. Simple maintenance became impossible. The industry didn't explode. It rusted. It stalled. It stopped. Venezuela could no longer produce the product that defined it. The relationship became impossible because one side could no longer hold up its end. The oil simply ceased to flow in meaningful quantities. The hidden pact ended not with a dramatic treaty annulment, but with the silent final gasp of 1,000 exhausted wells. When a partnership of this scale dissolves, the shockwave is global. U.S. refiners scrambled to recalibrate their machines. They sought replacement crude from Canada's oil sands, from the Middle East. Billions of dollars in trade flows rerouted overnight. Global markets absorbed the shock. Prices adjusted. New suppliers emerged. Venezuela plunged into deeper isolation and economic freefall. The weapon it had relied on was now useless. The tool of leverage was gone. The world observed a stark lesson in energy realism. Interdependence can be managed, but only if the underlying asset is maintained with ruthless competence. When ideology consumes expertise, the collapse is not just political, it is operational, total.
So where was the true point of no return? The single decision that made the collapse inevitable. It was not a sanction, not a speech. It was the internal choice, years before the crisis, to value political loyalty above technical mastery at PDVSA. The moment the guardians of the machinery were replaced by guardians of the revolution. That decision inserted a slow-acting poison into the system. It severed the industry from the knowledge that sustained it. It set a timer that could not be stopped. Compromise became impossible because one side was no longer a competent partner. The intent was to gain total control. The consequence was the loss of everything. This was the precise moment before things changed. This alliance reveals a durable truth about power. Oil does not erase ideology, it only finances the stalemate. It creates a temporary shelter where contradictions can coexist until they can't. Hidden alliances are the most fragile. They thrive in darkness and die in the light of political storms. They are agreements of immediate necessity mistaken for permanent strategy. The U.S.-Venezuela Pact was a masterclass in short-term necessity versus long-term reality,
a lesson that what is economically logical can become politically impossible, that no resource, no matter how vital, is immune to the consequences of its own mismanagement. So we are left with a final uncomfortable question. When necessity forces two enemies into a silent partnership, who is more vulnerable? The nation that controls the resource or the nation that has built its daily life around consuming it? The history of this alliance suggests the answer is not what we might assume.
It was the infrastructure that told the final story. Machines built for a century of service, falling silent in a decade. Each rusted bolt, each stagnant pipeline was a monument to a broken promise. The promise that oil could transcend politics, that necessity would always win over ideology. But machinery has no ideology. It follows the laws of physics and chemistry. Without precise care, without expert hands, it fails irrevocably. The people who understood those laws were gone. The engineers, the geologists, the project managers. First, they were sidelined. Then they were pushed out. Finally, they left the country, taking a library of institutional knowledge with them. What remained was a hollowed-out corporation, a shell with a famous logo, producing spreadsheets and propaganda instead of crude oil. The decline was not a sudden cliff, it was a slope, a 2% drop one year, 5% the next. For years it was possible to explain it away, blame temporary disruptions, sanctions, weather. But slopes have a destination, and this one led to the floor. While one system was decaying, the other was evolving. American refineries adapted. They became more efficient, more flexible. They found new suppliers, blended new crudes. They invested in artificial intelligence to optimize every fraction of a cent. The dependency, once so absolute, became negotiable. The unique asset was no longer unique. The irreplaceable partner had been replaced. This is the true end of the pact, not when the last tanker sailed, but when the buyer looked at the ledger and realized the relationship was no longer essential, when the cost of managing the chaos outweighed the benefit of the crude. That is the moment the silent agreement truly died, in a boardroom, on a spreadsheet, in a cold calculation of risk and reward. There were human relationships beneath the geopolitics, decades of technical exchange, shared projects, families that moved between Maracaibo and Houston. Those ties were frayed, then cut by forces far beyond the control of the people on the ground. They became collateral damage in a conflict of symbols and sovereignty. The story of oil is never just about barrels and dollars. It is about the people who find it, extract it, and the societies they build and unravel around it. Venezuela built a skyscraper on oil. The United States built an industrial diet around it. When the foundation cracked, both structures shuddered, but only one collapsed.
The evidence is written on the water. The shipping lanes tell the story of the divorce. Where once there was a steady, dense stream of traffic, a maritime highway of dependency, there is now empty sea. The tankers found other routes, other partners. The ocean, like the market, abhors a vacuum. It filled itself. The fundamental calculus changed. For the United States, the equation shifted from security of supply to security from instability. The cost of managing a volatile partnership began to exceed the value of the oil itself. For Venezuela, the equation shattered completely. You cannot leverage a resource you cannot produce. A weapon you cannot fire is just dead weight. In the United States, the end of the pact was an adjustment,
a recalibration in a complex global energy system. Some refineries underwent expensive retooling. Some gas prices saw marginal increases, but the lights stayed on, the trucks kept rolling. The system, built on diversity and redundancy, absorbed the shock. In Venezuela, the end of the pact was an ending, the final stage in a long closure. The nation that was once a global energy powerhouse now faces chronic fuel shortages at home. The circle closed with cruel symmetry. The treasure that built the country could no longer power its own cars. So what remains of the alliance that shouldn't exist? It exists as a case study, a lesson in the limits of realpolitik. It demonstrates that while oil can buy time, it cannot buy permanence. That hidden arrangements are the first to collapse when the pressure rises. And that the most fragile part of any system is not the steel or the software, but the human expertise required to sustain it. The flow stopped. The silence became permanent. And the world moved on, carrying the lesson to the next impossible alliance, the next necessary deal, the next moment before things changed. Before things changed. By the time the alliance reached its breaking point, the damage had already been done. Not by a single sanction, not by a single speech, but by years of erosion. Inside Venezuela's oil industry, the problems were no longer abstract. Facilities aged without proper maintenance, critical components failed more frequently, and temporary fixes replaced long-term solutions. Production capacity fell below sustainable levels. What had once been one of the world's most capable oil operations struggled to perform basic functions. Refineries shut down unexpectedly. Pipelines leaked. Export terminals operated intermittently. Each failure reduced confidence. Each delay compounded losses. Skilled workers continued to leave. Some sought stability abroad. Others exited the industry entirely. Their departure created gaps that could not be filled quickly or cheaply. Experience cannot be sanctioned back into existence. At the same time, government dependence on oil revenue intensified. With fewer alternatives available, oil became the sole remaining lifeline. Every barrel mattered. Every disruption carried political consequences. But the system could no longer respond. Where flexibility once existed, rigidity remained. Where redundancy once protected output, fragility took its place. The alliance with the United States, already weakened, now faced a practical limit. Even when cooperation was possible, delivery was not guaranteed. For U.S. refiners, the risks grew unacceptable. Inconsistent supply, unpredictable quality, and increasing political exposure. Adaptation accelerated. New sources were secured. Refining processes were modified, and dependence, once structural, began to loosen. For Venezuela, the situation was far severe. Declining output reduced revenue. Reduced revenue limited maintenance. Limited maintenance accelerated decline. The cycle reinforced itself. At this point, the alliance no longer failed because of ideology. It failed because the system could not support it. Oil, the force that once bound both sides together, could no longer perform that role. The pact had not been broken. It had become irrelevant.
The collapse of the U.S.-Venezuelan oil relationship did not occur in isolation. Energy systems are interconnected. When one link weakens, pressure shifts elsewhere. As Venezuelan exports declined, global oil markets responded. Prices adjusted, supply routes shifted, and producers in other regions filled the gap. For the United States, the transition was disruptive but manageable. Refineries that had once depended on Venezuelan crude adapted their processes. Alternative suppliers emerged. Domestic production increased. The adjustment took time and investment, but it was possible. For Venezuela, the consequences were far more severe. With fewer buyers and limited access to global financial systems, oil exports declined sharply. Revenue fell. Foreign currency became scarce. This scarcity spread quickly through the economy. Imports dropped. Infrastructure deteriorated further, and economic contraction accelerated. Globally, Venezuela's influence diminished. Once a central player in energy markets, it became increasingly peripheral. Its production, once capable of shaping prices, lost relevance. The alliance that had quietly anchored decades of energy exchange was gone. What replaced it was uncertainty. For other oil-producing nations, the lesson was clear. Resource wealth does not guarantee stability, and dependency, even when mutual, does not ensure durability. Energy relationships are not alliances in the traditional sense. They are arrangements of convenience. When conditions change, convenience fades. The collapse also reshaped diplomatic calculations. Governments reconsidered assumptions about long-term supply. Energy diversification became a strategic priority, and resilience replaced efficiency as the dominant concern. In this sense, the end of the U.S.-Venezuela Pact was not an anomaly. It was a warning, a reminder that systems built on quiet compromise are vulnerable, not because they are secret, but because they rely on conditions that rarely remain stable.
Sometimes, history is changed not by grand gestures, but by a single choice. For the U.S.-Venezuela alliance, that choice came quietly, almost imperceptibly at the time. A decision about financial access. As Venezuela's political and economic situation deteriorated, international banks faced pressure. Access to dollars, to credit, to basic transactions became increasingly restricted. This was not announced with fanfare. There were no headlines proclaiming a new turning point, but for Venezuela, it was decisive. Without predictable access to the global financial system, PDVSA could no longer maintain operations at scale. Contracts with foreign partners could not be executed reliably. Equipment, spare parts, and expertise became harder to acquire. And with every delay, every shortfall, trust eroded further. The U.S., meanwhile, had to consider its own domestic consequences. Continuing to engage carried risk, legal, political, and economic. Abandonment risked price shocks and political criticism. The result was a stalemate. No side could fully move forward. No side could fully disengage. Yet in that moment, recovery became mathematically impossible. The infrastructure could not respond fast enough, revenue could not stabilize quickly enough, and political constraints prevented long-term solutions.
Allies and competitors alike observed the shift. The message was clear. The alliance that had persisted for decades, quietly, invisibly, had reached its final limit, and the world would feel the consequences. It was a turning point defined by systems, not personalities, by logistics, not ideology, by the structural realities of oil, money, and dependence. History remembers speeches and sanctions, but the true pivot came in the margins, in the decisions few noticed, in the mechanisms that could no longer function. Before that moment, repair was possible. After it, collapse was inevitable. Before things changed.
The story of the U.S.-Venezuela oil relationship is not one of heroes or villains. It is a story of necessity, of dependence, and of the limits of compromise. Oil, a resource so often taken for granted, shaped decisions in ways few could see. It delayed conflict. It enabled cooperation, and it masked contradictions that would later prove fatal. Wealth and ideology, when intertwined, do not erase each other. They only reveal the fragility of systems built on convenience. The hidden pact between two nations, one publicly hostile, the other quietly dependent, lasted as long as the infrastructure and trust could support it. When those limits were exceeded, the consequences rippled outward, not only for the countries directly involved, but for global markets, regional stability, and the lives of ordinary people dependent on both. History often focuses on moments of confrontation, dramatic decisions, or public statements, but sometimes the most decisive changes occur in the quiet spaces, in logistics, in financial access, in the erosion of competence. The U.S.-Venezuela alliance failed not because of ideology alone. It failed because reality caught up to necessity. And no rhetoric, no negotiation, no public statement could stop it. In the end, the lesson is both simple and sobering. Power is fragile. Dependence is complex. And small, almost invisible decisions can change the course of history. Before things changed, the world depended on the illusion that convenience could substitute for stability. It could not. And that is the story of an alliance that was never meant